How's it going, ladies and gents? My name's Andy, and today we're gonna take a look at Robert Mugabe, the former Prime Minister and President of Zimbabwe. During his reign, it's been speculated that Mugabe directly or indirectly caused the death of millions of Zimbabwe citizens. Mugabe turned Zimbabwe, which was one of the fastest growing countries at the time, completely upside down. According to an article, before Mugabe took over in 1980, Zimbabwe's economy and GDP was steadily growing by 5% every year. If they maintained that rate from then until now, then the country would have had a GDP of approximately $52 billion US. But unfortunately, in 2016, it only had a GDP of $14 billion, which was astronomically lower than its expectations. A lot of people have had some mixed opinions on Mugabe's reign, and some have said that he's the main reason why Zimbabwe's economic and population growth heavily stagnated. So let's take a look at what he actually did. Mugabe, born in 1924, got elected as the first Prime Minister of Zimbabwe in 1980, but before that, he actually spent 11 years in prison, and that's because he made some public statements attacking the current regime. That didn't stop him though. He was still able to work his way up the political ladder, and he spent decades making connections and gained a lot of supporters. Oh, and by the way, Mugabe was arguably the most well-educated leader ever. Well, at least academically he was. He received a multitude of different academic and honorary degrees that he worked for years to achieve. Anyway, in 1980, he was elected as Prime Minister, and he vowed to create a country that would be peaceful and unified, especially with all of the tensions surrounding racial relations in the country. The country was actually named Rhodesia before Mugabe changed it to Zimbabwe in April of 1980. Unfortunately, one of his other first moves as Prime Minister led to some protests and uneasiness. Mugabe dismissed Joshua Nkomo, the founder of the Zimbabwe African People's Union, who was pretty popular amongst the people, so this caused a huge split and, of course, a lot of violence. In 1983, Mugabe sent a military brigade to the western part of Zimbabwe, where a lot of Nkomo's supporters lived. This brigade led to the death of about 10,000 people, and most of them were civilians. Additionally, Mugabe also got the support of the United States, who supported him with a lot of money because they hoped that he could create a stable government and help Zimbabwe prosper. The US also provided him with military support to stop the protests from the old supporters of the old Rhodesian regime. But instead of trying to use the extra budget and money to help improve the country's economy, Mugabe spent a lot of it on personal luxuries. Him and his leadership group took advantage of their status and used the money to buy themselves mansions, luxury cars, businesses outside of Africa, and also used the money to improve their own family's living conditions. As a result, Mugabe did not spend as much money to actually improve Zimbabwe as a whole. In a book by David Blair, he said that between 1980 and 1990 under Mugabe's leadership, Zimbabwe's economy grew by 3% every year, but this was basically overtaken by the population growth. There was a high demand for jobs, but a much lower supply, so the unemployment rate rose to 26% by 1990. Although this seems pretty bad, Mugabe did improve education in the country. He established over 1,000 new schools, improved literacy, and overall created a huge expansion for education and health. In 1988, Mugabe became the president, which was a way more powerful role than prime minister. And as the years went by, the country faced its highs and its lows. For a short period of time, the new education and health reforms helped the country prosper. But at the same time, anyone who dared to oppose Mugabe would usually end up getting killed. Mugabe was hungry for power and has stated before that he wants to rule Zimbabwe up until the day he dies. Because he was so power-hungry, it led to a lot of mass killings of people who opposed him. For example, Mugabe would support gangs who captured and seized farms owned by white landowners. He also said that the government was allowed to seize the farms as well without paying the landowners any money. As a result, food shortages were common and the economy was failing. At times, infants, children, and even adults too, they had no food to eat, and with the population rapidly increasing, the number of deaths followed. The racial relations between whites and blacks got even worse, too. The majority of land, businesses, farms, and banks were owned by whites, and Mugabe sought to fight against that. This led to them feeling very uneasy and believed that they were victims of Mugabe's regime, which caused a huge number of them to emigrate out of Zimbabwe. In 1995, it was also revealed that Mugabe was having a secret affair with his secretary, Grace Marufu, who he had 2 children with before the affair became public. Zimbabwe was in shambles as more skilled workers continued to leave the country and the economy continued to suffer. By 1998, unemployment reached dangerous levels. Roughly 50% of the adults in the country could not find a job. By 2005, unemployment levels reached a ridiculous 80%. 80% of the country was unemployed as the farm assaults led to agricultural failures. In 2007, according to the World Health Organization, the average life expectancy in Zimbabwe was only 35 years old, while 10 to 15 years before that, the average life expectancy was around 60 years old. By 2008, inflation increased by 100,000%. With all this going on, Mugabe stated that he needs the support to strike fear in the hearts of the white men, our real enemy. As I mentioned earlier, he would hire soldiers and gangs to capture farms owned by white landowners, and also justified it by saying that the land belonged to indigenous Africans over 100 years ago anyway, so they were just taking it back. These assaults would be so violent where sometimes you'd have people just murdering the landowners in cold blood and taking the land away from them. All of this sounds pretty bad, but to the eyes of many, Mugabe was seen as a hero. His supporters believed in him because they believed that he was getting rid of the oppression. Amongst all this, he did provide housing and better living conditions for thousands of poor African families. Over 100,000 African families settled on about 13 million acres of land, which was previously owned by white landowners. A huge portion of this country still supported Mugabe for his education reforms and all the help he gave to those families. And that's why he continued to be elected into power. Well, also because he would just kill anyone who opposed him, like I mentioned earlier.
The whites in this country, the most backward in terms of the enlightenment and education. Well, how do you speak about racist or racial practices without condemning them?
They're all racist, do you think?
Majority of them, not all of them. There's some very good ones.
Both the 2008 and 2012 Zimbabwe elections were heavily disputed, and it was believed that Mugabe rigged the voting system, but nonetheless, he still remained in power. It wasn't until 2017 when a coup d'etat eventually overthrew Mugabe's regime. On November 21, 2017, Mugabe was placed under house arrest, and finally resigned after 37 years of ruling the country. He was 93 years old, the oldest president in history. Mugabe's impact left a lasting legacy on Zimbabwe, and the entire world too. He was arguably the most controversial leader in recent history. According to a journalist, depending on who you listen to, Mugabe is either one of the world's great tyrants or a fearless nationalist who has incurred the wrath of the West. He greatly opposed colonialism, and during his reign, he made it known that he would do whatever it took to liberate Africans from being controlled. However, in doing so, he further divided the country. As I've mentioned before, he spent a lot of the budget on personal luxuries, traveling to places like London and New York City, and one of his sons was seen driving a brand new Rolls-Royce. One time, his second wife and First Lady, Grace, spent $150,000 in cash, shopping for clothes. Coming into office back in 1980, his motto was peace and unity, and he kinda did the opposite. But at the same time, a lot of people did love him, especially from third world countries who saw him as a hero. Unfortunately, when Mugabe stepped down as president, he left the new government with a country that had 25% of their population on food stamps. Hospitals could not afford proper cleaning materials, banks have accumulated millions of dollars in debt, and actual cash is nearly impossible to get. And that sums up the story of Robert Mugabe. Thanks everyone for watching, I hope you enjoyed that video, and I'll see you next time. Peace.